Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
Hey, Carrie. We have
yes, Megan?
a fun mug that I'm so proud of.
Yes.
I was like, okay, I'm going to launch it on Saturday. We'll do the intro for the episode on Monday, and I'm going to talk about how proud I am of this darn mug.
I'm proud that the color options.
Yes.
That you chose the color options that I suggested.
Yes. Well, I fought with Photoshop for a while about it, but...
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it was a nightmare.
Yes.
This is why I'm like, I hope you want to do it, because I can't design worth shit.
Yeah. But in case someone out there did not see our Twitter yesterday, or Saturday, we launched a mug, and you just have to see it. I don't want to ruin it for you.
Well, okay, how do they find it then?
Oh shit. I guess I don't want to force you to go to that one tweet. So there will be a link to it in our Vocal Fries Twitter bio. It's real cute. Makes a great gift for yourself or loved ones or enemies. I don't know.
Please buy it for your enemies. We now have some ads. So if you are a patron, we're going to start putting up all our episodes on patreon.com. If you're at the $3 or $5 level, then you get to have free access to this podcast going forward. So if you want to have ad-free episodes, www.patreon.com/vocalfriespod. Someone did say something to the effect, oh, you guys should talk about Fiona Hill's situation.
Yes.
And I thought we probably should do a real episode on it. But we can at least talk a little bit about this because it just happened this week.
Yes. Which also, speaking of a real episode on it, anyone who's listening right now and is like, I know exactly who you should talk to, or, whatever. You should,
or you are the person we should talk to.
Or you are that person. Let us know. Because Carrie tries really hard to teach me about the limited information she has on British accents and classism and regionalism. But she can only do so much.
Right. Yeah, because it's definitely not my lived experience.
Yeah, so Fiona Hill was, what is her role?
Yeah, okay. So she was an intelligence analyst under Bush and Obama. Mm-hmm. And then Trump appointed her as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council.
Okay. And then she resigned in July of
She resigned in July because, obviously...
the phone call. The impeachment hearings of why we're having these impeachment hearings, right?
The phone call happened after that.
Oh.
But it's all part of that stuff, right? Because Trump was trying to pressure Ukraine to do what he wanted, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. A lot of stuff there that we're not really the experts on. Anyway, so that's what she was.
Right.
And yeah, she was just... there was a hearing with her and some other dude who had some amazing expressions.
Yes.
However,
the real star,
or the thing that we're most interested in is that she has a British accent, an English accent, and in the US, it's interpreted as being kind of posh because any British accent sounds posh to most Americans.
Yes. Problematic, but yes.
well, yes, of course. All of these judgments are problematic in any direction, right? But anyway. Yeah. So she commented on this, like, yeah, people think that I have this posh accent, but really, like, in the UK, my accent is very working class and northern, and those two things are, especially in the 80s when she was growing up, were seen to be very bad.
Yeah.
Right? So she definitely does not have a posh accent within the UK. So it's just an interesting...
Well, it's just how...
Clash of cultures
and how important context is. And this, and I think I said it last year when we kind of did talk to each other about what our favorite episodes were, or like what we learned that we really just did not know before. It's me learning that in New Orleans... In New Orleans,
in
Louisiana, that French is disparaged. And I was just like, how is this possible? Like, where I am in the Southwest, French is like thought of as a quote unquote posh, or, you know, like you only learn it.
Language.
Yeah, you only learn it if you just have like all these like, you know, mental resources freed up, and you're like, I don't have, you know, like I might as well learn French, right? It's not, it doesn't seem as practical. Whereas Spanish in the Southwest is like, you know, unless you're non-Latinx, then it's, you know, I've talked about it before. It's just depending on who's speaking it, it's seen as good or bad. So for me to learn that French was actually something that was disparaged in the United States, it just blew my mind. And so having that context was really helpful for me. Having the context of Fiona Hill, I always forget the North and South thing. So Northern.
Yeah, that's really huge in the UK, like within England itself, right? So like there's also the Welsh and the Scottish within that one island, and then obviously there's Irish and blah blah blah, but within just the English part within England, there's this huge north-south divide, which London is the seat of power, blah blah blah. So,
and London's in the south, which you have to remind me.
Oh boy, you should visit London. We should go visit Issa.
Yes, Issa Worry. No, that would be great. But yeah, so it's just an important reminder that classism, regionalism, all of these things are always at play. That's why we have job security here.
Job.
I know. I was like, should I say the word job? That's a fake. That's not real. That's why we have a side project security.
Yes. Yeah, we can talk about these things forever. Forever.
Yeah. And there's parts of the world we haven't even got. Parts of the world. There are parts of the world we haven't even got to.
Most of the world. I mean, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, London.
Yeah.
and
Ghana.
And Ghana.
And
I think that's pretty much it. Oh, and Spain. A little bit of Spain.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. But we haven't really even delved deep into Spain, right? Like, there's stuff to talk about
my God.
in Spain.
Layered. An onion.
Anyway. So, this episode, we talked to Zach Jaggers about different ways of pronouncing words that are more like the language we borrowed it from or less like the language we borrowed from. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
I learned some things.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I always say that, like, there's a lot of characteristics that we have that are all bundled into certain beliefs, and how we pronounce some words is kind of bundled into our belief about the world. So Zach tells us about that. It's very cool.
Yeah.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Today we have Dr. Zachary Jaggers, who is a postdoctoral scholar of linguistics at the University of Oregon. So welcome, Zach.
Thanks for having me.
So happy to talk with you today.
Yeah, me too. You approached us, and I'm so glad that you did, because this work is really important and really interesting.
As cool as Carrie and I are, we don't know all the amazing people that are out there and that exist.
No,
obviously.
How could we?
So please approach us with the amazing stuff you're doing, because 1, we get to talk to you and learn things ourselves. 2, your work gets out there, and 3, we get to have a new friend. So thank you, Zach.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate it. I love that there's more of this kind of stuff going on too, because I think that's exactly it. Like getting it out there for like a broader audience, and just like having more of these discussions in like, just a more relaxed kind of setting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Like just imagine we're over a tea or a beer or something, like that kind of thing.
I'm literally drinking tea right now.
See? Exactly.
Well, I saw like on your website how like I think one of you does knitting and one of you does cross stitching.
Yes.
I was like, I do crochet. Let's just have like a needle crafting
Yeah,
party.
what we're doing. Yeah, exactly. Everyone can imagine us doing that right now as it's cold outside.
Yeah, and I do actually want to learn crochet, because I'm like, I don't know, it's a new skill and it's related, so that's next on my list.
And one hook.
One of these days.
One hook.
And one hook, yeah.
Different sizes depending on, but yeah, anyway.
Okay. So you so you have an article, a journalistic article, which is nice because not very many linguists do this. So awesome.
Yes.
Thanks.
With PBS, called "Your Political Views Can Predict How You Pronounce Certain Words." So maybe just tell us why you started working on that area.
Yeah. So I look particularly at loanwords, so like words that come into a language from another language. And this was particularly so following up actually on work by Lauren Hallou and colleagues, where they were looking at the variation of Iraq versus Iraq, and how it was pronounced by politicians in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so they had found that Democratic politicians were more likely to say Iraq, which is more like how that sounds in Arabic, the source language of this word, whereas Republicans were more likely to say Iraq or Iraq. So I was really interested in that and just like wanting to follow up on that. And so I wanted to just kind of look into like what is kind of like under the hood of that in the sense, like, okay, if we just kind of imagined like this patterns with political identity, I'm not going to tell you which party says it this way. You could probably predict which party says it which way. So I was kind of wanting to get at like, why is this happening in this way? So I followed up on that, looking at people's like globalist and nationalist ideologies, but also other ideologies like their language contact receptiveness, like how they feel about like multilingualism and language contact, and also their specific attitudes about like Arabs, Arab Americans, Islam particularly, but then also because of these broader factors like language contact receptiveness or like globalism, nationalism, I was also predicting that this was going to happen with other loanwords of like less political charge too. So just like words from other languages across the board, like Spanish or German or French, just like any loanwords at all. So, and then I found that same pattern that like, in general, people who identified as either Republican or politically conservative, I didn't quite treat this as much of a partisan thing, but more just kind of like a gradient political continuum, a more multifaceted thing, tended to use less source-like pronunciations is the term that I like to use. So just pronunciations that sounded less like how it's pronounced in its original language or where it comes from, like how people who identify with this more as the source say it, whereas people who identified more as democratic or as liberal tended to use more source-like pronunciations. And I also like to use less or more source-like, I think because like if you think about Iraq versus Iraq, like even the Iraq pronunciation isn't exactly like how it's pronounced in the source language, right? It's not like you're doing the like flipped R in the middle or like getting really into the phonetics, like the uvular stop at the end, so it's not exactly like how it's pronounced, but it's still like both of these are entirely pronounceable even within the confines of the English sound system. But like one of these still sounds closer to how it's pronounced by speakers of that language who identify more with that word and how it's pronounced. So that's kind of what I mean by when I say more or less source-like.
Well, I like that too, because then you're getting away from this kind of language that's like more or less correct, right?
Right.
Yeah. And that's where, and so like a lot of the discussion around like this pronunciation variable too, like tends to get used in that way where people are like, this is the correct way to say it. And I also really like to kind of reframe that discussion as like, let's move away from thinking of this as correct and let's really reframe this as thinking about like who identifies with this word, and kind of then that helps us think about like how are they impacted possibly by the way this word is pronounced, or like how might they be impacted by the way this word is pronounced, and like what can that reflect. And that's where I think like thinking about this ideology of globalism, nationalism, and getting a little into like what that was. So this was also a like kind of like a multifaceted questionnaire survey that I did, and kind of the three main aspects that it was getting at was like, one was just the general kind of nationalism, which is like someone's like hubris or pride in their country, you know, and then another was just like the like general like interest in like people or cultures or places that they might consider like foreign or different from like their country. And then the other facet of that is this like what I think of as this prescribed homogeneity, you know, like the idea that it's kind of like, you know, we should all be one, but what that can sometimes end up meaning is we should all be similar to each other. We should all be alike, you know, and there's like degrees of that, you know, where you can see like, you know, we should all have similar ideologies or we should all have similar thoughts, but sometimes that can also extend into demographics, you know. So this was all kind of like along a scale of seeing how people identify, you know, to like different extremes or like in the middle of these things, but also along these different facets. So like this was a multifaceted kind of thing that I was trying to get at in terms of this ideology. But I think like seeing that people who identified as more globalist, rather than like more globalist or less nationalist, were like using these more accommodating pronunciations, these more source-like pronunciations. I think that seems to be reflecting this kind of like trying to be accommodating to people who identify with the source of these words and with the pronunciations of them. That's kind of at least what it seems to be reflecting.
Underlying that, to me, I mean, this is me editorializing it, but the word respect comes to mind. Like you're trying to respect that culture, that person, whatever it might be. Did anyone, so was your questionnaire open-ended, or was it like a checkbox or like a Likert scale, like 1 to 5? How did you get at kind of nationalist or not nationalist, these kind of things? Because I'm wondering about all these words that are coming to mind.
Yeah, this was like a Likert scale. So this was like a series of Likert scales. So like getting at those different facets, and then like multiple like statements of like Likert scale agreement. So like one of them would be like, so in terms of like the assimilation, so like the prescribed homogeneity, like I talked about, would be like, I think that I am waving at a cat walking behind Carrie.
That was me.
I want you to be behind me so I can pet you.
She would love it.
But so like thinking about the like prescribed homogeneity part, so like one of the statements was something along the lines of like, I believe that immigrants to the country should be expected to adopt American cultural practices. So that would be this idea that's like, you know, foreign people should assimilate, you know, to cultural practices, you know, like we should have these kind of shared values or practices. And you can see that kind of analogizing to words, right? You know, it's like, I feel like people who are foreign, who come into the country, should assimilate in their like, you know, in their practices to a way that feels less foreign and fits in more. And you can see that also applying to words, right? Like I feel that like words that enter the language should assimilate to a pronunciation that fits in more and feels less foreign. But there's also been like thinking about like, I also did a follow-up like a perception survey getting at like people's this was another like rating survey, but getting a little bit more like people's ratings of like how they think of people of like a speaker when they use more source-like or less source-like pronunciations of loan words, and like very similar percepts where it was like I think of like more source-like pronunciations as more like globally oriented, as like this person being more likely multilingual. Also, like there was this kind of what we were getting at, which is this kind of conflict where it was like more like pleasant in one sense, but also more along like a humble pretentious scale, more pretentious. so it's this kind of like, I think that they're like open-minded and accommodating, but I think that they're also like pretentious or like trying to be like above it all in a sense. So I think that is a conflict that comes into play with this, which is, I think, this decision that people seem to wrestle with, which is like, I'm accommodating, but who am I accommodating to? Am I accommodating to the borrowing language and this force to assimilate? Or like, if someone is like a speaker of the borrowing language, like, am I accommodating to this like surrounding force around me to assimilate these words to the borrowing language, or am I accommodating more to the people who identify with these words? And so that's what this ideology and where you fall on it is kind of being reflected in your pronunciations.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that in myself, like that I want to pronounce it as close as possible to the original, but it does have this feeling of, I sound pretentious now. And people talk about it on Twitter too, like, oh, you're pretentious if you pronounce it whatever way. Like even like the foyer difference. I say foyer, I'm Canadian, so like we pronounce it closer to the French. But I feel more pretentious here saying it that way.
Yeah. You should have heard my inner dialogue just calling you pretentious when you said that. I've never heard you say that word, so I didn't know you said it that way. But this is getting really complicated because there is some power structures going on here where I'm like, oh, French, well, we have an episode on this, but I'm just thinking about French globally. Mm-hmm. I'm like, it's fine. Mm-hmm. And then I think about how we're in the American Southwest, Carrie and I are, and I'm like, well, Spanish is under attack because racist.
Yeah, I think those power dynamics are definitely a thing. And I think there's a lot of factors that go into influencing like how loanwords get pronounced and like how they get adapted into the borrowing language. And so I think there's just like the sound system in general, right? Which is like, so I was talking about like with Iraq versus Iraq, you know, and just how like just the sound system has an overriding factor in general in a lot of cases where you're probably not going to do that flipped R, or like if you do, that's really saying something about like how accommodating you're wanting to be to the source language and people who identify with it, which is a statement in and of itself, or something about like we've also seen effects of just like how bilingual the community is, where like these where these loanwords are being used. You know, like if there's a higher degree of bilingualism in that community, then you know you would expect maybe even some like transcending of the constraints of the borrowing language system, where there might even be some phonetic level incorporation of sounds that wouldn't necessarily be considered allowed in the borrowing language. But I think these power dynamics and like the prestige dynamics also come into play a lot. So like, and even with like, so with the borrowing of words themselves too. So like when we think about like borrowing of words, like oftentimes we'll think of it just as like the borrowing of like a cultural concept or just like a new, like a cultural transmission or a conceptual transmission, right? So if we are like borrowing something, so like if we think of words that like English and German share, where it's like, this is just like shared inheritance, like not even a borrowing at all, you know? So we think of like hound versus hund, you know, like this is something that's not a loan word, but this is something that like they still share, right? Where like the sound and the meaning like are shared, right? Whereas like they both are shared from Proto-Germanic. So in German, this became, it used to mean just like general dog. And in German, it still does. Whereas in English, it then shifted to become like hound, but it also shifted to become like in meaning to mean like a narrower kind of dog. But we also see loan words between German and English, where there's like these kind of cultural transmissions that like after that split, like historically, like long after German and English became distinct languages, right? Like they then there were these cultural transmissions, so like kindergarten, zeitgeist, schadenfreude, so like schadenfreude, the joy of like, enjoying someone else's pain, so it's like that is like the kind of word where people were like, I can say that, I don't need this word from another language to say it, but it's appreciating like, oh, this other language has this like succinct word that I can use to express this idea, I'm gonna use that. But we also see cases where there's a loan word from another language used in a borrowing language where it's not because there was some kind of like quote hand quotes. I gesture a lot. I know.
No, it's okay.
I'm sure this is like such a challenge with like podcasting. Like I'm a very like I use my hands a lot when I talk.
So do I.
We all do. A lot of us do. Yeah.
So hopefully my gestures are audible. But so when we think about like how there's not necessarily like hand quotes gaps that are because of like that is why a loan word came into another language. So if we think about like, like cases like even like salsa could be considered something where it's like, we could have used like tomato sauce or dip or something like that, where it's like, it doesn't necessarily accurately capture it, but it could have been not borrowed in to represent that concept. Or if we think of cases like, so this is getting back into like the prestige factor. So like the French-Spanish asymmetry. So hang in there with me. So like, thinking about, so cases like, if we think of like veal, so like veal versus horse. So like veal was borrowed into English from French. So this was like right around like the Norman conquest time when French was in like really intense contact with English, but also with a lot of prestige. Whereas right now, there's a lot of, in the US context, there's a lot of contact with Spanish, but not with a lot of prestige, right? But so we see a lot of this contact with French where veal gets borrowed in, and we also see like pork, like the French, so these are already now the like long adapted versions of them, but like pork, is like the French etymological origin, word for pig gets borrowed in. And those are the French words for those animals, but those ended up getting used to represent the cooked versions of them. And we also see cuisine, which is the word for kitchen in French, and that gets used to represent food. So we see this asymmetry of like the older Proto-Germanic origin, like the English words, they're representing like the labor side versus like the fancier side in a sense. So like kitchen is like where the labor of preparing the food happens. And then like the farm animals are like the English side, whereas the French side is where like the animals are cooked and you're eating them. And the cuisine is like, that's where the cooked food is coming out and you're enjoying the cooked food. So it's kind of like that asymmetry of these words that you have the exact parallels of. That asymmetry ends up kind of getting semantically reflected in like which language's version of those words you're using, in a sense. But we also see that in the pronunciations too. So like a lot of times, like people will say like, but you have these really old words too, where you don't see these variable at all in pronunciation, or like cases like veal, people don't even know that that's a French loan word. But you see these reflections of these ideologies and of this prestige around French still being reflected in the way that we use it historically. Right. But you also even see that in the pronunciations too. So, in like Old English couldn't allow for the sound V, like the voiced V, to appear at the beginning of a word. But when there was like this huge influx of loan words from French, you then had all of these words with the V sound, the V sound at the beginning of the word. But because people were using all of these French loanwords, and because they were, in that case, not even just using more source-like pronunciations of them within the confines of the English sound system, but they were actually like breaking the rules of English and being like, I'm going to pronounce these so French-like. I'm going to break those rules and maintain this V sound at the beginning of the word. And that carried on where these words are still pronounced with the V sound, and that totally changed the sound system of English. So like the English sound system can have V at the beginning of the word now because of all of these French loanwords, and because people pronouncing them in more source-like ways because of the prestige that was associated with them. So it's like, not only can you just pronounce these words more source-like because as a reflection of your attitudes about the source language and the people associated with them, but you can even in some cases like break the rules of the borrowing language if you associate like the source language with that much prestige.
Yeah, and it has survived so long. These sound changes to the English language,
Yeah, where you like don't even know it.
Wow, yeah, I had really no idea. I mean, if I would have thought about it, I would have probably realized that Old English didn't have a V sound at the beginning.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I did know that we borrowed sounds from French. I just didn't know about V at the beginning.
At the beginning, Know. Wow, that's really cool. And it speaks to, I mean, it just shows that if you examine language a little bit deeper, you're going to see all of these things that reflect how we think about people.
Yes, right. Absolutely.
Yeah, how like social dynamics just really come through and get reflected like historically, and like they manifest in language, and just thinking about how they propagate in language. And so I think coming back to just thinking about like with new loanwords too is, kind of just raising that question of, do people want to use more source-like pronunciations, and, what do we want that to reflect? Do people want that to reflect a kind of accommodation or openness? Because when we think of just how, like, even if people aren't thinking of like, oh, I'm using this initial V sound, as a way to like signal openness to French speakers anymore, it still does kind of in a way, or like it leaves English and French sounding a little bit more similar to each other, or you'll think about like these, like I'm thinking about these YouTube videos where like, have you seen where like someone who speaks like two really different languages, but then they're asked like, how do you say this word in your language and this word in your other language? And then they're like, oh, we have these two words.
Oh, I have seen those.
Then but like you just see this, and like they're probably loan words, right? Yeah. But they have this sense of like, oh, we have this shared linguistic thing in common. Like, yay! Like this is a fun friendship, or something like that. So it's just like when you have this linguistic thing in common, you have this kind of shared sense with each other. And so like even if you aren't actively like thinking about that, just thinking about like how are you propagating that for future accommodation.
I'm thinking specifically when you said that of Spanish and Arabic. I've seen video where it's like
there's a lot of that.
Like almohada, like pillow. What?
Yeah.
Guys are like Arabic? No, you're right. It's never like, I mean, of course they probably wouldn't be like trying to find the most terrible people in the world to record to do this, but every time they're just like, it's like an opening, like their world has opened a little bit. Like that's what it feels like when you're watching this. Like, you're those are quite lovely. I do like those. Yeah.
So let's go back to the Iraq thing. So is it the case that if you pronounce it, let's say Iraq, that you're for sure a Republican or for sure a nationalist?
No. So I think like a lot of times people will like want to read this as a generalization, and it's hard to like when I do like public facing work, like it's hard to kind of like make this connection with people, but also be like, hey, like you saw how in my article I used relative adjectives and likelier than, right? So yeah, no, definitely not. So what I found was So these were definitely relative likelihoods where in terms of like across these loanwords across the board, people who identified as more politically conservative or Republican were likelier to use less source-like Republicans than people who identified as Democrats or as politically liberal. But actually, like in most cases, this was, for most words, there was still like more of a default of the more adapted, less source-like pronunciations, so people would be usually across the board, like across people would be likelier to say something like Iraq or Iraq than they would be to say Iraq. But if they identified as politically liberal or as Democrat, they would be likelier to say Iraq than other people. So there was still like a slightly higher likelihood that they would use more source-like pronunciations. But then when I looked at the other predictors, like the stronger predictor, and then so like I won't get into the weeds of like statistical comparison and stuff, but just like the better predictor was actually the globalist nationalist alignment. So like that actually seemed to explain a lot of the pattern with politics. So it was actually like it was a better predictor whether they aligned as more globalist or nationalist, whether they would use a more or less source-like pronunciation, which I think kind of also helps like get at a little bit trying to remove politics from this in a sense, or at least like thinking about how like if this is a better predictor than political identity, then maybe both these pronunciations and also these ideologies are not necessarily the same as political identity in and of themselves. So like there's at least like some room for like thinking about some nuance in there and thinking a little bit more about like, maybe these pronunciations are reflecting like how people think about these pronunciations' impacts on people who identify with the source, like that's reflecting these ideologies a little bit more. So, I mean, maybe that's a little too far reaching, or like getting at like my kind of wanting to try to get away from like the politics, but, thinking about just like what this data is saying about some of the nuances in there.
I came of age, and are you a U.S. Citizen? Did you grow up here?
Yeah.
I came of age right when George W. Bush was president and 9/11 happened. So what I heard over and over again, I'm trying to remember. I think he said Iraq, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have some recordings of Iraq and also some of Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Bush. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Iraq, over and over again. And that's how I thought that was said, because I was like 13, 14, until I realized, and I feel like the rhetoric from him around that was like, we need to beat them. They are evil. We are not evil, which is a very like nationalist thing. And when I started to get more nuance into my understanding of the world, I was like, oh, here comes like other people. And then Barack Obama comes, and they say Iraq.
As a candidate for president, I pledge to bring the war in Iraq to a responsible end. So
I'm like, I'm going to start saying it like that. So I made a conscious decision, because I was like, he's talking about it a certain way, and I'm noticing he's saying it a different way. I'm going to pronounce it like him. Did you have any experience with that?
Well, yeah, and I think that's a big thing too, is just like recognizing that the pronunciations that you've heard around you definitely matter, right? That like I think there should be a huge asterisk that like as much as this seems to at the aggregate level say some like, be predicted by people's ideologies, that doesn't necessarily mean that like every single person's pronunciation of every single word is like this very conscious decision saying something about their ideologies, and definitely not saying something about like they surely fall along the extreme on all these ideological or political dimensions, so like there should be that huge asterisk there. But like, and so like what people heard pronounced around them definitely matters. But I think thinking about so that's kind of like the past, right? Like what things they have heard influence them. But there is also the thinking about like what this means moving forward. And I think those ideologies also seem to influence people there too. So I think that is part of that, is deciding like, okay, maybe now I've heard a different pronunciation, or maybe now if I have this different ideology, do I want to be more attentive to looking up pronunciations or like how these words are pronounced in their source languages, and like try to like evaluate, is the pronunciation I'm using now the degree of accommodating the source pronunciation that I would like to apply? Or is there a degree further of accommodating that source pronunciation that I would like to apply further? And that is kind of a reflection of your ideology. So, yeah. I should disclaim that I also did, so Lauren Hall-Luke and colleagues' study, they were looking at politicians, and those politicians were from lots of different regions. And so like they didn't control, but they were able to account a little bit for like those politicians' regional identities, and their regional accent varieties. And they did not find that to have a significant effect. So it did not necessarily seem like their political identities were like the effect that they saw was totally just because of political identity correlating with regional accent variety. I had to take a different approach. So I totally like controlled for regions. So I just like ran this all in like one place. So that was where, like, by still finding this effect, even when I was doing this study in one place, that was what was suggesting to me, like, okay, this effect is still real and not all just because of people's regional accent. But, you know, caveat, I wasn't looking at the whole country. But I also did, part of that study was also thinking about the like moving forward component. I also did a study looking at how people treated new words. So I exposed people to like fake words that they'd never heard before. And I like framed those words to people as like, this is a foreign word from like a foreign language. And they were just like fake words. So like Shinya versus Shinya, or like Sloxy, you know? So, and then I looked at I exposed them to those words in like a short story that they heard. And then afterwards, then I had them like read a sequel that then got them to say those words out loud again. So then I could see like, how well did you imitate the word that you heard? And then I found the same effect, where like people who were more nationalist aligning than globalist aligning were more likely to stray from the pronunciation that they had heard. So if they had heard Shinya, they were more likely to say Shinya, or vice versa. But also like if they had heard Sloxy, they were more likely to say Slosky. Whereas like if they had been more globalist aligning, they tended to be more faithful to the pronunciation that they had heard before. So at least in terms of like new words, there also seems to be that same effect. So like when you're stripping the effect of like the pronunciations that they had heard before, that effect seems to hold. But we should still remember that like, you know, the pronunciations that people have heard before do matter. So like, you know, we should still be careful about like, you know, just because you're using this pronunciation, that definitely means all of these things about you.
Right. I say as a scientist, that's a really fucking clever experiment.
Yeah, that was really good. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, so like with Iraq, like I feel like my pronunciation varies quite a bit from like sentence to sentence. And I even studied Arabic for 2 years pre 9/11. So I knew how Iraq should be pronounced. But yeah, like even with all that background, I still like sometimes say Iraq. So yes, obviously, yeah, one pronunciation tells you nothing.
Right. And like audience is totally a thing too.
Yeah.
And I think also thinking about like how these pronunciations are clearly charged, given the whole like the pretentious judgment thing too, thinking about like who you're speaking to matters, and especially thinking about like, given all of the political charge just around everything lately, but also around this topic, like around this speech feature, thinking about like if you're talking to different groups and not wanting to like add a political charge element, is there a degree of accommodating that you want to do there? But again, then also weighing that with, how much are you accommodating people who might not be in the room, that kind of, yeah.
Right. I thought it was really interesting that you brought up Obama and Pakistan as opposed to Pakistan.
I am gravely concerned about the situation in Pakistan.
I don't hear that very often in the United States, that pronunciation. It's very rare. It's not that common in Canada either, but I think it's a little bit more common to hear it, the Pakistan. He was even thanked for it, which I thought was very interesting. Like, should we maybe be trying to do this more often if it makes people feel better about their language or their country or whatever?
Yeah, it's a really complicated, so I think definitely so like I said before, in terms of just like how the pronunciations you've heard around you and like how that plays a really big role, and just how your sound system plays a really big role in the pronunciations you use. And so like one element is just like, to what degree are you considering a pronunciation more or less source-like? So I think we should just be really careful in just judging people's pronunciations right off the bat, especially if we're thinking about the intent there. So I think that's one case where I think avoiding like judging certain pronunciations is like, would be just in general, like we should avoid judging certain pronunciations, especially given that we see that there are a lot of factors at play. I think that would be really crucial. But I think that this does kind of balance a certain line, right, of also thinking about how pronunciations can reflect certain biases and also manifest and propagate those. And so thinking about that too. And so like how, when we think about, a lot of times this tends to be on the perception end, that we want to try to encourage people to be more accommodating, right? So like accommodate, like being accepting of different people's language varieties, right? Because they identify with those language varieties, right? And so we want to give them that space. But so I think what this variable raises, like what this linguistic variable, this phenomenon raises, is the question of like, does pronunciation come into play there a little bit? And there are other realms where thinking about language production also comes into play. So when we think about like ways that the language people uses seems to be a way of manifesting and propagating certain biases, right? And that does tend to be the times when people like identify directly with a certain form of language and the usage of it. I think even just like when I growing up as gay and hearing like "that's so gay" used, right, like as a pejorative, where I'm like, that's something that I identify with, right? And so, I'm obviously like, this analogy is somewhat different. So like there's those flags to raise, right? But just hearing like, this is a linguistic form that I identify with, but it's being used in a very different way than I would like to hear it used, frankly. And so like trying to advocate for like, hey, it'd be nice if people didn't use it that way is a hard thing to do. But also like, I remember seeing articles like citing linguists and quoting linguists, where linguists are like, language changes and, this meaning is changing. And so like some people are just using this in a way that means something different. So, we should just, be careful in the way that we think about that and judge people about it. And I'm like, but I get that in some ways too, right? Where it's like, because people are using this in ways that they don't know, right? Like they don't know the biases that this is getting at, and they maybe do think of this in a different way. And so I think this is getting back to the pronunciation, similar or at least analogous in some ways, where it's like, what biases is this reflecting and propagating, but still is there a way that we can kind of call out that and, try to, propagate some kind of accommodating space, like some kind of space for, and I think the way to reframe that discussion is thinking about like, how do people identify with this form of language and how might they be impacted by that? So I think, in terms of thinking about like the use of like something that someone really directly identifies with, like, the use of "that's so gay" in that way, is a very clear case of like, this is something that people are using that is discriminatory. So there are ways that we can, try to make people aware of that discriminatory nature of it, even then without necessarily being judgmental of them, because we recognize that they have been indoctrinated into this usage, and because this is a reflection of the broader society that they have been around. And I think the pronunciations too, especially like pronunciations like someone's name that someone like really directly identifies with, right? Like we see this with names a lot of times too, where like people's names, especially people from like ethnic and linguistic minority backgrounds with names that get mispronounced a lot, where like they personally identify with that. Like it would, Mary Buckholtz has a really good paper on this, like talking about like how we can be attentive to students' names and thinking about like how to, make sure that we try to pronounce them in the way that they want them to be pronounced. And I think that is a really crucial thing to be attentive to, because they identify with those names and the pronunciation of them, and hearing them pronounced in a different way does feel marginalizing. And so we can then move forward in thinking about like, does this apply to loanwords too? Maybe to a lesser degree, maybe not, but also maybe mitigated by other factors like the sound system, or factors like how long this loanword has been established in the borrowing language. So factors like that, but still asking ourselves, is there a degree to which we can accommodate a more source-like pronunciation of this word that gives space for people who identify with the source pronunciation of this word that feels less like this kind of enforced assimilation? So it is a complicated variable where there's a lot of elements to think about, like how directly do people identify with this source pronunciation and what mitigating factors there are, and how can we keep this from feeling super like prescriptive and judgmental while still like thinking about the biases that might be reflected and propagated in the use of less source-like pronunciations. But I think really framing this as thinking about the people who identify with the source is a good stepping stone.
Well, to go to names, I do feel like proper names and place names, they're closer than, say, you had like foyer. Like it feels less important to pronounce foyer the closer to French way. Although again, with names, it depends on how, like, what sounds are in that name, how likely it is an English speaker is going to be able to pronounce it correctly. And so it's tough. You should try. You should still try.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then there's the whole, I've said this before on the show because my last name gives me problems with people are like, so maybe they're overcorrecting. And I mean that like from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate it. But they're like, so I'll say, yeah, my name is Megan Figueroa. And they're like, oh, no, but how do you really say your last name? And I was like, oh, no, but that's how I really say it sometimes. Yeah. And it's okay. It's what you just said before, Zach, was beautiful and nuanced, and I love it. And it's, I have so many thoughts, so many pure, like beautiful thoughts, but I'm thinking like, yes, listen to the person. Like that might be like, just like the one thing to take away, because, yes, language changes. We should not use that as an out. Because once we know that language change is coming from a discriminatory place, we have the responsibility to take action, to take proper action and be like, okay, oops, I'm sorry. I'm going to do better next time.
Yeah. If it's your own name, like just like how, like there'll be people, who who prefer to use different versions of their name. So like especially so like there'll be lots of people who identify with who like have Chinese names but who prefer to identify with Anglo names in the US because they don't want to use Chinese names. But then like there'll be people who are like, no, but like really I want to use your Chinese name, but they're like, no, I would like you to use this name.
Exactly.
And so it is like,
Yes.
listen to them. But I think there is space where like this does come back around to loanwords too, where like we do, but where it is also complicated because we do see like there is discourse where like we can see people who like are Latinx and who are like, like maybe don't, go so far in pronouncing your Spanish words with like a totally like Spanish phonetics,
Well,
when you're
yeah.
speaking English,
Sometimes
Or,
it feels like mock
especially if you're
Spanish,
white,
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so like broaching that territory. And so being attuned to that or, just trying to be attuned to that. But there was also, when my article came out, I don't remember, someone on Twitter linked my article to another thing that had happened where the Prime Minister of Australia was at this Diwali celebration event, and he was talking about like celebrating diversity, and he was using like the melting pot analogy, which is nuancedly complicated, but but his melting pot that he used was an Indian dish, and he pronounced it garam masala, but people in the audience, so like this is like a totally like a South Asian Australian audience, and like someone in the audience was like garam masala, and so like they tried to like ask him, tried to like prod him like, could you change your pronunciation because that's not how we say it, and so it does kind of get it like there is some degree to which even like non-proper words like are still something that people identify with and would like there to be some accommodation of those pronunciations too. But I think, thinking about the people who identify with them and what they want is something to be attuned to and to keep trying to be attuned to, and the nuances thereof as well. Yeah.
So I think in that case, it's because it's a culturally significant thing, whereas foyer is not. It'll never be. Like, I don't think a French would care at all. Maybe I'm wrong. Please tell me if I'm wrong.
Some of us don't have foyers.
I don't have a foyer.
Excuse me.
Okay, this has been a really, really great conversation.
Yeah.
But, maybe as the last question, how can we go about not being assholes about all of this?
I think really this is all kind of just summed it up is like, not judging people, thinking about how there's lots of factors that go into their pronunciations, but still at the same time thinking about, how people might identify with the source or as the source, especially with names, and thinking about how, using more or less source-like pronunciations might be a manifestation of certain biases or attitudes about them, and how there's still room to move forward and thinking about the degree to which people want to accommodate to those people with their pronunciations.
I was thinking too, like sometimes speaking up and saying, "Oh, it's actually pronounced this way," is really hard.
It is
so
hard, yeah.
Just a little effort on your part after someone did something really hard, Even
I actually did eventually correct one of my professors because he would always say carry, like because it's spelled with an A, and then in the UK you make a distinction between e and a. But I can't do that before R. Like, it has to be carry. Like, I don't have carry. So I finally, corrected him. And, I've got a bunch of privilege. It was still hard for me. So, if someone tells you, yes, definitely listen to them.
Yeah.
He never fixed it. It's all right. It's all right. It doesn't matter.
Oh, that was a sad ending to that story.
My grandmother also pronounced it that way because she had like a more British, even though she was born in Canada, she had a more British accent slightly because her dad was English. Yeah, it's fine.
You know who you are.
It's not, for me, it's not the end of the world. Like, but yeah,
no,
anyway.
it's, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, thanks again so much for coming on the show,
Yeah.
Zach. This is great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great hearing your thoughts too.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Y'all, don't be assholes.
Don't be an asshole.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.